The author and publisher have provided this ebook to you for your personal use only. You may not make this ebook publicly available in any way. Copyright infringement is against the law. If you believe the copy of this ebook you are reading infringes on the author's copyright, please notify the publisher at us.macmillanusa.com/piracy. Contents: title page, copyright notice, epigraph, ether, God, and devil I. The workshop of ergonomic functionalism 2. The two basic pillars of human thought, God and ether 3. Organ sensation as a tool of natural research 4. Animism, mysticism, and mechanistics v. The realm of the devil 6. Cosmic argon energy and ether, cosmic superimposition I, stage and meadow 2. Survey on man's roots in nature 3. The function of superimposition 4. The living argonome v superimposition in galactic systems 6. The ring of the aurora borealis, R76-7. The meaning of R76-8. The rooting of reason in nature notes, bibliography of works by Reich on argon energy, glossary, index, books by Wilhelm Reich. Copyright. Love, work, and knowledge are the well springs of our life. They should also govern it. Wilhelm Reich. Chapters 1-4 in Ether, God, and Devil and Chapter 4 in Cosmic Superimposition have been newly translated from the original German manuscripts by Therese Pohl. All other parts of these works were written in English by Reich. In this edition, minor editorial revisions have been made. Mary Higgins, Trustee, Wilhelm Reich Infant Trust Fund, New York, 1973. Ether, God, and Devil. What is the hardest thing of all? That which seems the easiest for your eyes to see, that which lies before your eyes. Goethe. Chapter I. The workshop of ergonomic functionalism. The cosmic argon energy was discovered as a result of the consistent application of the functional technique of thinking. It was these methodic, rigidly controlled thought processes that led from one fact to another, weaving across a span of about 25 years seemingly disparate facts into a unified picture of the function of nature, a picture which is submitted to the verdict of the world as the still unfinished doctrinal framework of ergonomy. Hence it is necessary to describe the functional technique of thinking. It is useful not only to allow the serious student of the natural sciences to see the result of research, but also to initiate him into the secrets of the workshop in which the end product, after much toil and effort, is shaped. I consider it an error in scientific communication that, most of the time, merely the polished and flawless results of natural research are displayed, as in an art show. An exhibit of the finished product alone has many drawbacks and dangers for both its creator and its users. The creator of the product will be only too ready to demonstrate perfection and flawlessness while concealing gaps, uncertainties, and discordant contradictions of his insight into nature. He thus belittles the meaning of the real process of natural research. The user of the product will not appreciate the rigorous demands made on the natural scientist when the latter has to reveal and describe the secrets of nature in a practical way. He will never learn to think for himself and to cope by himself. Very few drivers have an accurate idea of the sum of human efforts, of the complicated thought processes and operations needed for manufacturing an automobile. Our world would be better off if the beneficiaries of work knew more about the process of work and the experience of the workers, if they did not pluck so thoughtlessly the fruits of labor performed by others. In the case of ergonomy, a look into a corner of the workshop is particularly pertinent. The greatest difficulty in understanding the argon theory lies in the fact that the discovery of the argon has solved too many problems at once, and problems that were too vast: the biological foundation of emotional illnesses, biogenesis, and, with it, the cancer biopathy, the ether, the cosmic longing of the human animal, a new kind of physical energy, etc. There was always too much going on in the workshop, too many facts, new causal connections, corrections of dated and inaccurate viewpoints, connections with various branches of specialized research in the natural sciences. Hence, I often had to defend myself against the criticism that I had overstepped scientific limits, that I had undertaken too much at one time. I did not undertake too much at a time, and I did not overreach myself scientifically. No one has felt this charge of too much more painfully than I have. I did not set out to trace the facts, the facts and interrelations flowed toward me in superabundance. I had trouble treating them with due attention and putting them in good order. Many facts of great significance were lost that way, others remained uncomprehended. But the essential and basic facts about the discovery of cosmic argon energy strike me as sufficiently secure and systematized for others to continue building the structure I could not complete. The multitude of new facts and interrelations, particularly the relationship of the human animal to his universe, can be explained by a very simple analogy. Did Columbus discover New York City or Chicago, the fisheries in Maine, the plantations in the South, the vast waterworks, or the natural resources on America's west coast? He discovered none of this, built none of it, did not work out any details. He merely discovered a stretch of seashore that up to then was unknown to Europeans. The discovery of this coastal stretch on the Atlantic Ocean was the key to everything that over several centuries became North America. Columbus's achievement consisted not of building America but of surmounting seemingly immovable prejudices and hardships, preparing for his voyage, carrying it out, and landing on alien, dangerous shores. The discovery of cosmic energy occurred in a similar fashion. In reality, I have made only one single discovery, the function of orgastic plasma pulsation. It represents the coastal stretch from which all else developed. It was far more difficult to overcome human prejudice in dealing with the biophysical basis of emotions, which are man's deepest concern, than to make the relatively simple observation about bions or to cite the equally simple and self-evident fact that the cancer biopathy rests on the general shrinking and decomposition of the living organism. What is the hardest thing of all? That which seems the easiest for your eyes to see, that which lies before your eyes, as Goethe put it. What has always astounded me is not that the argon exists and functions, but that for over 20 millennia it was so thoroughly overlooked or argued away whenever a few life-asserting scholars cited and described it. In one respect, the discovery of the argon differs from the discovery of America. Argon energy functions in all human beings and before all eyes. America first had to be found. An essential and comprehensive part of my activities in the workshop lay in learning to understand why people in general, and natural scientists in particular, recoil from so basic a phenomenon as the orgastic pulsation. Another part of my work, which brought down on me much dirt, dust, and plain garbage, consisted of feeling, experiencing, understanding, and overcoming the bitter hatred, among friends and foes alike, that formed a roadblock everywhere to my orgasm research. I believe that biogenesis, the ether question, the life function and human nature would long ago have been conquered by many scientific workers if these basic questions of natural science had not had but one axis, the orgastic plasma pulsation. When I succeeded in concentrating on this single problem for 3 decades, mastering it and orienting myself within its fundamental natural function, in spite of all obstacles and personal attacks, I began to realize that I had transcended the conceptual framework of the existing human character structure and, with it, our civilization during the past 5,000 years. Without wanting to, I found myself outside its limits. Hence I had to expect that I would not be understood even if I produced the simplest and most easily verifiable facts and interconnections. I found myself in a new, different realm of thought, which I first had to investigate before I could go on. This orientation in the new functional realm of thought, in contrast to the mechanistic mystical realm of patriarchal civilization, took about 14 years, roughly from 1932 to the writing of this work, 1946 and 1947. My writings have often been criticized for being far too compressed, forcing the reader to make a strenuous effort at concentration. It has been said that people prefer to enjoy an important book in the same way they enjoy beautiful scenery while cruising at leisure in a comfortable car. People do not want to race toward a specific goal in a straight line at lightning speed. I admit that I might have presented the function of the orgasm in 1,000 instead of 300 pages, and the argon therapy of the cancer biopathy in 500 instead of 100 pages. I further admit that I never troubled to familiarize my readers completely with the conceptual and investigative methods on which the results of ergonomy are based. No doubt this has caused much damage. I claim extenuating circumstances insofar as I opened up several scientific fields over the decades, which I first had to set down in a condensed, systematic form in order to keep up with the development of my research. I know that I have built no more than the scaffold and foundation of my structure, that windows, doors, and important interior features are missing in many places, and that it does not offer a comfortable abode. I ask to be excused because of the pioneer nature of this basically different research. I had to gather my scientific treasures rapidly, wherever and however I found them. This happened during the brief intervals between 6 changes of domicile forced upon me partly by peaceful circumstances but partly by extremely violent social upheavals. Furthermore, I constantly had to start from scratch in earning a living, first in Germany, 1930, then in Copenhagen, 1933, in Sweden and Norway, 1934, twice in the same year, and in the United States, 1939. In retrospect, I ask myself how I succeeded in accomplishing anything essential at all. For almost 2 decades I lived and worked on the run, so to speak. All this precluded a congenial and secure atmosphere, without which it is impossible to give congenial, extensive descriptions of discoveries. I must reject another criticism, namely, that I unnecessarily provoked the public by the word orgasm in the title of a book. There is no reason whatever for being ashamed of this function. Those who are squeamish about it need not read further. The rest of us cannot allow others to dictate the limits of scientific research. When I began this book, I planned to make up for what I had denied to myself and others for so long in terms of breadth and more graphic presentation. I hope I will now be spared the criticism that I have taken my research too seriously by giving it too much space. Since everything in nature is interconnected in one way or another, the subject of ergonomic functionalism is practically inexhaustible. It was essentially the humanistic and scientific achievements of the 19th and early 20th centuries that merged with my interests and studies of the natural sciences to form the living body of work that eventually took useful and applicable shape as ergonomic functionalism. Although the functional technique of thinking will be described here systematically for the first time, it was nevertheless applied by many scholars more or less consciously before it definitely overcame, in the form of ergonomy, the hitherto rigid limits of natural research. I would like to mention the names of those to whom I am primarily indebted: Koster, Dostoevsky, Lang, Nietzsche, Morgan, Darwin, Engels, Seemann, Bergson, Freud, Malinowski, among others. When I said earlier that I found myself in a new realm of thought, this does not mean that ergonomic functionalism was ready and merely waiting for me, or that I could simply appropriate Bergson's or Engels's conceptual technique and apply it smoothly to the area of my problem. The formation of this thought technique was in itself a task I had to accomplish in practical activity as a physician and scientist struggling against the mechanistic and mystical interpretations of living matter. Thus I have not developed a new philosophy that adjacent to, or in conjunction with other philosophies, tried to bring the processes of life closer to human comprehension, as some of my friends believe. No, there is no philosophy involved at all. Rather, we are dealing with a tool of thought that we must learn to apply before investigating the substance of life. Ergonomic functionalism is not some luxury article to be worn or taken off at one's discretion. It consolidates the conceptual laws and functions of perception that must be mastered if we are to allow children and adolescents to grow up as life-affirmative human beings in this world, if we want to bring the human animal into harmony again with his natural constitution and the nature surrounding him. One can oppose such a goal on philosophical or religious grounds. One can declare, purely philosophically, that a unity of nature and culture is impossible or harmful or unethical or unimportant. But no one can claim any longer that the splitting up of the human animal into a cultural and a private being, into a representative of higher values and an ergonomic energy system, does not, in the truest sense of the word, undermine his health, does not harm his intelligence, does not destroy his joy of living, does not stifle his initiative, does not plunge his society time and again into chaos. The protection of life demands functional thinking, in contrast to mechanistics and mysticism, as a guideline in this world, just as traffic safety demands good brakes and flawlessly working signal lights. I would like to confess to the most rigid scientific ordering of freedom here. Neither philosophy nor ethics but the protection of social functioning will determine whether a child of 4 can experience his first genital excitations with or without anxiety. A physician, educator, or social administrator can have only one opinion, not 5, about the sadistic or pornographic fantasies a boy or girl develops during puberty under the pressure of moralism. It is not a question of philosophical possibilities but of social and personal necessities to prevent by all possible means the deaths of thousands of women from cancer of the uterus because they were raised to practice abstinence, because thousands of cancer researchers do not want to acknowledge this fact or will not speak up for fear of ostracism. It is a murderous philosophy that still favors the suppression of natural life functions in infants and adolescents. If we trace the origins and wide ramifications of public opinion, especially with respect to the personal life of the human masses, we find time and again the ancient, classic philosophies about life, the state, absolute values, the universal spirit. They are all accepted uncritically in an era that has degenerated into chaos because of these harmless philosophies, an era in which the human animal has lost his orientation and self-confidence and senselessly gambles away his life. Thus, we are not concerned about philosophies but about practical tools crucial to the reshaping of human life. What is at stake is the choice between good and bad tools in rebuilding and reorganizing human society. A tool alone cannot do this work. Man must create the tools for mastering nature. Hence it is the human character structure that determines how the tool will be made and what purpose it will serve. The armored, mechanistically rigid person thinks mechanistically, produces mechanistic tools, and forms a mechanistic conception of nature. The armored person who feels his organotic body excitations in spite of his biological rigidity, but does not understand them, is mystic man. He is interested not in material but in spiritual things. He forms a mystical, supernatural idea about nature. Both the mechanist and the mystic stand inside the limits and conceptual laws of a civilization which is ruled by a contradictory and murderous mixture of machines and gods. This civilization forms the mechanistic mystical structures of men, and the mechanistic mystical character structures keep reproducing a mechanistic mystical civilization. Both mechanists and mystics find themselves inside the framework of human structure in a civilization conditioned by mechanistics and mysticism. They cannot grasp the basic problems of this civilization because their thinking and philosophy correspond exactly to the condition they project and continue to reproduce. In order to realize the power of mysticism, one has only to think of the murderous conflict between Hindus and Muslims at the time India was divided. To comprehend what mechanistic civilization means, think of the age of the atom bomb. Ergonomic functionalism stands outside the framework of mechanistic mystical civilization. It did not rise from the need to bury the civilization, hence, it is not a priori revolutionary. Ergonomic functionalism represents the way of thinking of the individual who is unarmored and therefore in contact with nature inside and outside himself. The living human animal acts like any other animal, i.e., functionally, armored man acts mechanistically and mystically. Ergonomic functionalism is the vital expression of the unarmored human animal, his tool for comprehending nature. This method of thinking and working becomes a dynamically progressive force of social development only by observing, criticizing, and changing mechanistic mystical civilization from the standpoint of the natural laws of life, and not from the narrow perspective of state, church, economy, culture, etc. Since, within the intellectual framework of mechanistic mystical character structure, life itself has been misunderstood, abused, feared, and often persecuted, it is evident that ergonomic functionalism is outside the social realm of mechanistic civilization. Wherever it finds itself inside this realm, it must step out of it in order to function. And functioning means nothing but investigating, understanding, and protecting life as a force of nature. At its inception, argon biophysics possessed the important insight that the functioning of living matter is simple, that the essence of life is the vital functioning itself, and that it has no transcendental purpose or meaning. The search for the purposeful meaning of life stems from the armoring of the human organism, which blots out the living function and replaces it with rigid formulas of life. Unarmored life does not look for a meaning or purpose for its existence, for the simple reason that it functions spontaneously, meaningfully, and purposefully, without the command "thou shalt." The interrelations between conceptual methods, character structures, and social limitations are simple and logical. They explain why, so far, all men who understood and battled for life in one form or another consistently found themselves frustrated outsiders outside the conceptual laws that have governed human society for thousands of years, and why they so often suffered and perished. And where they seem to penetrate, it can be consistently shown that the armored exponents of mechanistic mystical civilization time and again deprived their doctrine's life-affirmative element of its specific characteristics and embodied it into the existing conceptual framework by diluting or correcting it. This will be discussed at length elsewhere. Here it suffices to prove that functional thinking is outside the framework of our civilization because life itself is outside it, because it is not investigated but misunderstood and feared. Chapter 2: The two basic pillars of human thought, God and Ether. Whoever looks back on the development of human society 1,000 or 5,000 years from now will very likely find the crucial turning point of human orientation in our own time, the 20th century. Removed from its emotional turmoil, and from a higher vantage point, he will perceive the large outlines that shape the errors of the human animal. He may also discern the first faint beginnings pointing toward his own time. The standpoint from which the human animal will examine and judge his history and his present will be the science of life. What has dictated the life forms of the human animal today and in the past 6 millennia will be a matter of historical criticism. What finds itself today outside civilization will be the judge of the past, if my functional technique of thinking is correct. This is not a prophecy but an inevitable logical conclusion. For if it is correct that the mechanistic and the mystical life philosophies have, each in its own way, attacked the living element in the human animal, if it is correct furthermore that mechanistics and mysticism derived their methods of thinking from the negation of life, it must be equally correct that their collapse will be brought about by the discovery of the life process. Even today it is clear that both mechanistics and metaphysics have cruelly failed as tools of human existence. Now it is a rule of development that false conceptual systems continue to exist until their bankruptcy leads them to develop new conceptual systems that then take over to guide human destiny. Bankrupt thought systems first drown the life of the human animal in blood and tears before any life-assertive thought is stimulated to ensure life itself. If an organism is dying, the life function struggles to the last breath in mighty convulsions, the death agony against ultimate stillness. By the same token, society fights against strangulation from false conceptual systems by creating new ones that in the light of existing ideas may seem revolutionary or radically new. Upon careful examination they turn out to be desperate attempts to revive very old ideas that could not prevail at the time or were deprived of their vitality by the sluggish thinking human masses. The energy observed in the agonal struggle of a dying animal is not basically new or alien or energy from another source. It is the same innate life energy that drove the organism to look for food and to enjoy life. Likewise, the modes of thought that were erroneously described as radical or revolutionary and led to a new social order in times of crisis were not newly introduced or concocted, they can be traced to the very beginnings of human organization. It is not hard to establish the fact that they are even older than those thought systems which they tried to overcome time and again, often in vain. This is true for both the mechanistic and mystical worlds of ideas. We find the accent on life thousands of years ago in the ancient thought systems of the great Asiatic religions such as Hinduism, certainly in early Christianity, and in the beginnings of the natural sciences in antiquity. The position of life, of the biological, is therefore not new and does not have to be introduced. It is the oldest position in human thought. One is even tempted to say that it is the most conservative. This raises the logical question of why it remains so powerless and was displaced by other thought systems that time and again drove humanity into disaster. Today, and certainly to our observer 5,000 years from now, it must seem very strange that, in spite of their cruelty and futility, the life-negating thought systems could persevere and torture mankind. How this could happen is indeed a question that requires an answer. Can it be given? At present, I am merely trying to outline the wide range covered by this book. When I confronted the task of formulating the principles of ergonomy and their underlying thought technique, I faced a dilemma. Ergonomy is the science of the functional laws of cosmic argon energy. There were two ways of organizing the material, the one was academic, or detached, the other was human, or involved. Involved in what? Mainly in the objective accuracy of scientific observations, facts, and interconnections. Certain functions of nature, hitherto unknown, had to be described and defined. In the process of this important work, I was time and again disturbed by one specific question: why did man, through thousands of years, wherever he built scientific, philosophic, or religious systems, go astray with such persistence and with such catastrophic consequences? Scientific skepticism is necessary and justified. As natural scientists, we are professional non-believers because we know man's vast capacity for error, the unreliability of his impressions, and the enormous area of erroneous judgments. And yet the question is justified and necessary: is human erring necessary? Is it rational? Is all error rationally explainable and necessary? If we examine the sources of human error, we find that they fall into several groups. Gaps in the knowledge of nature form a wide sector of human erring. Medical errors prior to the knowledge of anatomy and infectious diseases were necessary errors. But we must ask if the mortal threat to the first investigators of animal anatomy was a necessary error too. The belief that the earth was fixed in space was a necessary error, rooted in the ignorance of natural laws. But was it an equally necessary error to burn Giordano Bruno at the stake and to incarcerate Galileo? Reason tells us that we cannot find rational, comprehensible grounds for the burning of Bruno, and for similar massacres no immediate grounds, that is. The answer that this is how it always was is no answer at all, but merely an expression of sluggish thinking. Though the human animal errs in its concept of nature, it nevertheless erects a conceptual structure that, while wrong, is inherently consistent. The inner logic of erroneous thought systems is comparable to the inner consistency of a paranoid delusion. Both the conceptual and the delusional systems are even related to some part of reality. But in both the thinking departs at a certain point from objective reality and develops an inner logic of errors of its own. We understand that human thinking can penetrate only to a given limit at a given time. What we fail to understand is why the human intellect does not stop at this point and say, "This is the present limit of my understanding. Let us wait until new vistas open up." This would be rational, comprehensible, purposeful thinking. What amazes us is the sudden turn from the rational beginning to the irrational illusion. Irrationality and illusion are revealed by the intolerance and cruelty with which they are expressed. We observe that human thought systems show tolerance as long as they adhere to reality. The more the thought process is removed from reality, the more intolerance and cruelty are needed to guarantee its continued existence. This cannot be explained by saying, "People happen to be like that." This is no insight at all. However, the stubbornness of such a pretext betrays a secret meaning. Let us try to find it. New systems of thought are intended to overcome the errors of the old systems. As we well know, the former spring from the contradictions of erroneous thinking, which has become divorced from reality. Since it derives from this realm of thought, the new system carries some of the old sources of error into its new structure. The new thought system grows in the logical, although incorrectly arranged, old one. The pioneering intellectual spirit is socially tied to his own time. To this is added a purely psychological factor, namely, that the pioneer does not want to discard altogether the erroneous conceptual system, with its comfortable, familiar features. He would like to be understood in his own time, without having to stand entirely outside it. Hence he neglects to use his critical faculties, takes over erroneous concepts, or disguises his innovations by using dated, sterile words. The new system vacillates, too insecure to find its own ground. But the old system, which is under attack, enjoys public applause and contemporary esteem. It is backed by organization and power. To illustrate our point, let us examine several of the great human errors in natural science. The great revolutionary astronomer Copernicus developed his conceptual system from the critique of the Ptolemaic system. Yet he took over Ptolemy's concept of the static center of the universe by substituting the sun for the earth. He took over the idea of the perfect world system, which, in his time, was presented in the form of a perfect circle and uniform motion. With the idea of perfection, the idea of the divine was introduced into the new system. We will see the continuing effect of this error for centuries. It was composed of three erroneous concepts: the perfect, the divine and the static. If we look for realistic proof of these three elements in his system of thought, we cannot find a single supporting fact. Yet this grandiose error must originally have had a function. Kepler developed his own system of thought from the framework of the Copernican system. He corrected the Copernican perfect circle of the Earth around the Sun, stretching it into an ellipse and thus breaking the idea of perfection. While Kepler demonstrated no process in nature that caused the Earth's path to become elliptical, he nevertheless formulated his three laws of planetary motion, which are valid to this day. As will be shown later, trigonometry follows his harmonic law, confirms it and makes it comprehensible in terms of energy. Kepler also did away with perfect, uniform motion by proving that, in its course around the Sun, the Earth's radius vector moves over equal areas in equal times. Hence the Earth moves fastest where it is nearest to the Sun at its perihelion and slowest where it is most distant from the Sun at the aphelion. As we shall see later, Kepler even found a clue to cosmic argon energy when he asked himself which force was responsible for the attraction of the Earth to the Sun. He already knew about the energy field. He knew that the Sun also rotates, and the field with it, but his Sun is fixed in space. It does not move on its own, it is the final frame of reference for the Earth's motion. Although the error of the Sun's fixed position was subsequently corrected, it still persists in practice. Today's calculations of planetary motion still begin with the concept of the static Sun. Otherwise Kepler's functional law, which describes an ellipse with the Sun at its focus, could not be applied. After all, the ellipse, like the circle, is a closed geometric figure. The Sun in motion as the center of the planetary system would logically preclude the idea of an elliptical path of the planets. It would open the path of the planets. If we look for the core of these vast errors, we encounter the static element time and again. It continuously permeates all scientific concepts. Even Kant, who corrected so many gross errors of his time, who raised the function of human knowledge itself to the goal of natural research, allowed the static element, in the form of the absolute metaphysical moral principle, to sneak in. It seems as if human thinking cannot or will not shed the static notion. There is invariably something resting and motionless in the abundance of things in motion. It reemerges in the contemporary idea of cosmic dust. It appears to be absolute, independent of any functional process, as if it were a part of eternity. What does all this mean? The inaccuracy of such concepts is self-evident, including their proof, which still remains to be furnished. Anyone who attempts to trace the error that permeates all thinking should first ask himself if his own conceptual perspective is foolproof. He should ask if there are any guarantees against basic errors in thinking, and what they consist of. The result of this needed self-criticism is contained in this book, in which the basic conceptual principles of argonomy will be examined. They can be summarized roughly as follows. 1. There are basic principles of a thought technique that are objectively valid and controllable. 2. There is a logical development in finding facts of nature that will prove the applied conceptual technique to be right or wrong. A theory is correct only if it leads to the discovery of new basic facts, not only to details of known facts. 3. The factual foundation of a correct conceptual technique relates to the evolved theory as the base of a pyramid relates to the apex. The larger the scope of logically interwoven facts in relation to the theory, the more reliable is the latter. The smaller the factual basis in relation to the theory, the faster the theory will collapse. Conversely, we should reject as unscientific those thought techniques in which a broad theory relates to the facts as the pyramid base relates to the apex, or those techniques that have no factual foundation at all. For the scientific observer must know his own perspective lest he make incorrect statements. He must know in which functional realm of nature he and his objective are placed. 5. The scientist will increase his errors in proportion to the neglect of his own system of sensory perceptions and awareness. He must know how he himself functions when he perceives and thinks. If we accept these criteria of correct thinking, we have also gained access to one of the most important sources of human error, the ignorance of the scientist or thinker with regard to his own conceptual system and his sensory perceptions. In other words, every previous thought technique of the human animal was in danger of attributing to nature certain qualities of human structure that cannot be found in a given object of nature. The same is true for the other danger, namely, to evade functions in the human structure that are unknown or discredited, even though they, too, are found in nature. The complete failure to recognize an existing, basic, cosmic energy must be attributed to the effects of the second danger. If I say failure to recognize an existing, basic, cosmic energy, I mean its natural scientific comprehension, not merely theoretical formulations about it. I mean its factual proof, and not intellectual constructs without factual foundation. This distinction is important if I am to lend credibility to my assertion that the human animal has known about the existence of a primordial cosmic energy since the beginning of recorded history. I would like to elaborate on this point because it is a part of determining my own position in the investigation of nature. I noted in my introduction that my research and conceptual technique were outside the ways of thinking of the past 5,000 or 6,000 years of civilization. Where outside? This was not easily established. Until after I had discovered argon energy in the atmosphere and had comprehended its general cosmic nature, I could not know that I was inside the realm of basic, cosmic functions when I discovered and described the function of the orgasm. But at the start of my work this positive orientation of my scientific perspective was lacking. I could tell only where I was not where I was. To work without knowing his positive standpoint is an intolerable burden to the scientist. Hence it is understandable that I, along with many of my scientific contemporaries, was clutching at straws in the chaos, under the illusion that I could in that way make myself secure. Thus I committed several gross and dangerous errors in my thinking. The fact that I was finally able to free myself from them should be attributed to my discovery of the much maligned function of the orgasm rather than to my intellectual superiority at that time. These conceptual errors were characterized by a chaotic abundance of contradictory prejudices and mistaken judgments. I shall try to group them synoptically, according to the sequence in which I committed them. Let us organize the realms of human thought according to their increasing scope. The following schematic drawing will illustrate my point: diagram of the realms of human thought and their objective interdependence. The social life about the time of the First World War, 1914 to 1918, in spite of Marx and Nietzsche, was governed by the idea of guilt, by absolute morality. The moral existence of the human animal was subject to conscious moral responsibility. Everything evil that happened was blamed on the evil will of man. The damage caused by Schopenhauer to human thought affected intellectual circles just as much as did the original sin of the Church. Man as a conscious being was held fully responsible for morality and justice, and as a citizen for his thoughts and acts. To this day he has not freed himself of this erroneous thinking. There was no logical question as to where consciousness and will originate. Consciousness, will and responsibility were indestructible metaphysical conditions, existing from time immemorial, absolutely and forever. Nietzsche's magnificent critique of morality had no social impact. It was not a part of the zeitgeist, such as will and guilt. but it paved the way toward an important step, the step into the realm of unconscious psychic life, investigated and comprehended by Freud. One should emphasize that while organized religion made use of guilt in the moral consciousness, guilt was not actually anchored in man's consciousness. I shall return a little later to this matter. Depth psychology put an end to the absolute nature of consciousness, along with conscious guilt, by proving that consciousness reflected the unconscious psychic life. But it fed such notions as the absolute, the eternal, and the guilt concept from the realm of moral consciousness back into the unconscious. Now human guilt was no longer rooted in conscious malevolence and immorality but in the instinctual drives of the unconscious. The child appeared as a polymorphous perverse human being, as a wild animal that had to be tamed and adjusted to culture. This was the enormous error in the second realm of knowledge. Today, the guilt of the malevolent unconscious in man dominates the thinking of a large public. Because of the mysteriously stubborn wrong-headed thinking of the human animal, we must suspect that we will have to drag along this error for centuries to come. By definition, such errors tend to become fixed, to widen their sphere of influence as far as possible and to anchor themselves in dogma, without proof. For the next logical question is, where do the malevolent unconscious drives originate? In what functioning realm of nature is the rationality of thinking anchored? From which function of nature stems the famous human mind according to which the malevolent animal in the infant must become adjusted to high culture? In psychoanalysis, both intellect and unconscious drive appear as gigantic, static, eternal configurations. There is neither a whither nor a yon. This error of depth psychology, which was clinically refuted by sex-economic investigations, is supported because only a few depth psychologists have any useful knowledge of natural science in general and of the biosociological interdependence of emotional problems in particular. Feeding on the emotional misery of the human animal, a large number of psychologists, except for those who remained fixed in the old realm of consciousness, barricaded themselves behind the absolute, static processes of the malevolent unconscious and defended every attack on this bastion by all available means, except scientific ones. Of course, I do not deny the existence of malevolent unconscious emotions in the human animal, and I have often said so at length. But in my concept, man is part of the rest of nature. Hence his malevolence is placed into another functional system which has an origin, a reason for being where it is, and an end, like all natural functions. The question of whether man is fundamentally a good-natured or a malevolent animal is irrelevant. We are not concerned with moral theology. We want to know what place man holds in the totality of nature, with his good and evil drives. This is our position in the investigation. If we try to give a more exact description of nature, we encounter two other large systems of thought: sociology and biology, 3 and 4 in our diagram. If we place ourselves temporarily outside prevailing opinions, the answer seems simple, even commonplace. Somewhere, sometime, life began to differentiate from the rest of nature. What we call human society today developed after millions of years from the wide realm of life. It is a specifically differentiated part of the living realm, just as that realm is a specifically differentiated part of nature. This conclusion is correct even if we cannot say anything as yet about the how of these two differentiations and their internal functions. The reverse conclusion, namely, that nature is part of the living realm or even a principle of society, would be absurd. As an individual, man is subject to the laws of life and to his social circumstances. In the primeval past, an infernal mixture of false ideas disturbed this simple relationship between man and nature. To this day, the human animal has not been able to free itself, and in the future this large third error will presumably victimize just as many human lives as it did in the past millennia. All genuine natural science stands outside the given social framework. It judges the essence of human existence in the vast context of nature. The given social framework does not harmonize with man's objective position in nature but reflects the erroneous concepts that, in the course of time, the human animal has formed about its position in nature. We find a great part of this enormous error in the inability of the masses of people even to think about their position in nature, in their tendency to follow blindly the heresies taught by individuals and, beyond that, to persecute and torture anyone who tries to clarify this error. In the 20th century, the masses have not transcended the state of dull, merely vegetating existence into which they have fallen since those tremendous errors took hold. The problem is the hate-ridden rejection of all fundamental knowledge of nature. Let us review the crude details of these enormous errors. Standing outside the conceptual framework of this civilization, we are not obliged to turn right or left to see if we would harm certain interests or offend personal sensibilities. Our perspective is too far removed to permit any offense to our personal integrity from any side. Neither are we interested in whether people believe us or not, since this cannot possibly shake our logical thought processes. One of the most glaring errors is that, without knowledge of himself, the human animal has drawn conclusions about itself and applied them to the essence of nature. This is true not only for the so-called prescientific era of antiquity and the Middle Ages but also, very acutely, for the present. Now this is an error of basic thinking. Since man is a part of nature, and not the other way around, he can only draw conclusions from nature, and never the reverse. Even where we study the perceptual and conceptual apparatus of the human animal itself in order to learn how we perceive the world around us, we must investigate the natural functions in man. In other words, we must derive sensory perception itself from natural, physical processes and must not examine them outside the processes of nature. Aside from the unthinking masses of human animals who succumb to social suffering, we find that the large conceptual systems, including their errors, were accomplished only by individual human animals. They did not think in a vacuum. Their questions about the existence of man and nature were dependent upon their biological and social existence. Nevertheless, they did confront these functioning realms and thought about them. The ability to think in itself must have astounded them. Cogito ergo sum. The history of natural philosophy is the history of this astonishment about the ability to think, to perceive, and to judge, right up to Kant and to the dull classes in logic at secondary schools and universities. Surprised by his own ability to think, man was trapped by the erroneous conclusions about himself and applied them to nature. We understand this surprise and the subsequent false conclusions. But we do not understand his stubbornness and the cruelty of his wrong-headed insistence on it. We understand the origin of the idea that the earth is the center of the universe and that Mount Olympus is peopled by all manner of gods. But we do not understand the murderous hatred toward anyone trying to correct these false ideas. We understand how the idea of Homo sapiens developed. But so far no one has plausibly explained why, in the Middle Ages, the study of the human organism was forbidden. This is all the more incomprehensible since the human animal presented himself on every occasion as the living incarnation of his ideas. Rationally, man, first and foremost, should have studied his own organism. The anthropomorphic view of nature is far older than the mechanistic one. It is also far older than knowledge about man. Today, in the 20th century, this knowledge is scarcely 120 years old. We pose questions in order to define our standpoint and its surroundings. We have not even tried to furnish answers. We only want to know the nature of the area in which we build our scientific home. It is not our objective to explain this environment. We only want to know as much as possible about its qualities. The more we question, the more we are surprised. We are amazed at the abundance of conceptual errors committed in the course of a mere few thousand years. We do not gloat, we feel very humble, whence springs the enormous tendency to err. Attitudes of stoical superiority and detached philosophy will not do. Unless we succeed in tracking down the compulsion toward error, it is pointless to add one more error to the many others. Human animals talk and write far too much in a vacuum anyway. Those concerned with the function of knowledge itself must exercise the most rigorous self-control. No other approach can be taken seriously. Let us investigate further. It is permissible to claim that psychology is man's oldest method for orienting himself in his environment. It is certainly no coincidence that until quite recently psychology was taught in conjunction with philosophy. The study of nature was intimately connected with the study of emotional life. The machine age did not develop any natural philosophy, but it introduced the mechanistic viewpoint into psychology and natural philosophy. When I say mechanistic, I mean a still undefined mixture of various concepts grouped around matter and its motion. Until the discovery of radium, roughly 40 to 50 years ago, matter appeared to be static, visible, palpable, unalterable, ruled by the law of the conservation of matter, moved by a force, absolute, eternal in the form of atoms and cosmic dust. The absolute and the static were taken over even by such dynamically oriented psychological schools as Freud's in the form of given unconscious ideas. With Jung, the unconscious emotional life became the static archaic unconscious and the static collective unconscious. Together with the static viewpoint, many branches of psychology, even after they broke with philosophy, took over the problem of guilt. This drove them into a blind alley, from which there was no exit. For to give up the static, absolute standpoint of the emotional and sensory apparatus is tantamount to giving up psychology as a science of ultimate natural functions. The next logical consideration invariably is this: the emotional elements cannot have existed from time immemorial, they must have developed. With this consideration, both the material and the static viewpoint collapse. Development is, by definition, a dynamic process. Hence, there is no longer any firm resting point, all has slipped into flux. For someone psychologically oriented only toward the static and absolute concepts, this means losing his psychic bearing. If the archaic unconscious and the biologically absolute Oedipus concept are no longer the responsible culprits, who then remains to take over the guilt, equals original sin? Who then is responsible for the tremendous misery? So far we have been in the second domain, that of the unconscious emotional life. We are now entering the third domain, that of the social human community. Here too we encounter the absolute and the static, the scapegoat. We are still investigating, without trying to understand anything. As before in the psychic and moral realms, we again encounter the idea of original sin. The absolute depravity of the human animal is also to blame in the social domain. If man were not so lecherous, carnal, and sinful, there would be paradise. It is intriguing to speculate why a human system of thought that has lasted through the millennia never penetrated far enough to question where lust, carnality, and sinfulness came from. If they are absolute and eternal concepts, if the Son of God had to be crucified to free mankind from its grave guilt, divine creation cannot possess the degree of perfection attributed to it. The divine creature called man, who is also deeply sinful, is a flagrant contradiction in terms. No doubt the scholastic clerical viewpoint describes some kind of reality. But even this reality is static and eternal, in terms of guilt and sin, in the concept of eternity and in the idea of God. We are also on safe ground if we assume that the idea of guilt established the power of the Church, and not the other way around. Therefore, what does all this nonsense of eternal guilt mean? Religion, with its metaphysical error of absolute guilt, dominated the broadest, the cosmic, realm. From there, it infiltrated the subordinate realms of biological, social, and moral existence with its errors of the absolute and of inherited guilt. Humanity, split up into millions of factions, groups, nations, and states, lacerated itself with mutual accusations. The Greeks are to blame, the Romans said, and the Romans are to blame, the Greeks said. So they warred against one another. The ancient Jewish priests are to blame, the early Christians shouted. The Christians have preached the wrong Messiah, the Jews shouted and crucified the harmless Jesus. The Muslims and Turks and Huns are guilty, the Crusaders screamed. The witches and the heretics are to blame, the later Christians howled for centuries, murdering, hanging, torturing and burning heretics. It remains to investigate the sources from which the Jesus legend derives its grandeur, emotional power, and perseverance. Let us continue to stay outside the St. Vitus dance. The longer we look around, the crazier it seems. Hundreds of minor patriarchs, self-proclaimed kings and princes, accused one another of this or that sin and made war, scorched the land, brought famine and epidemics to the populations. Later, this became known as history. And the historians did not doubt the rationality of this history. Gradually the common people appeared on the scene. "The queen is to blame," the people's representatives shouted, and beheaded the queen. Howling, the populace danced around the guillotine. From the ranks of the people arose Napoleon. "The Austrians, the Prussians, the Russians are to blame," it was now said. "Napoleon is to blame," came the reply. "The machines are to blame," the weavers screamed, and "the lumpen proletariat is to blame," sounded back. "The monarchy is to blame, long live the Constitution," the burghers shouted. "The middle classes and the Constitution are to blame, wipe them out, long live the dictatorship of the proletariat," the proletarian dictators shout, and "the Russians are to blame," is hurled back. "Germany is to blame," the Japanese and the Italians shouted in 1915. "England is to blame," the fathers of the proletarians shouted in 1939. "And Germany is to blame," the self-same fathers shouted in 1942. "Italy, Germany, and Japan are to blame," it was said in 1940. It is only by keeping strictly outside this inferno that one can be amazed that the human animal continued to shriek guilty, without doubting its own sanity, without even once asking about the origin of this guilt. Such mass psychoses have an origin and a function. Only human beings who are forced to hide something catastrophic are capable of erring so consistently and punishing so relentlessly any attempt at clarifying such errors. The answer rested in the biology of the human animal. But he had already closed the access to this domain, too. He had barely started to think in terms of biology when he blocked all progress by falling into the vast error of hereditary predisposition and hereditary degeneracy. Now it was not only the Jews, Japanese, Christians, Huns, Russians, capitalists, Negroes who were to blame for all this calamity, but genetic traits were responsible. Children who were ruined by sick parents were condemned for having a hereditary taint. Drinkers who took to the bottle to escape their social plight were regarded as having an inherited tendency to drink. Women who sold their bodies because they were hungry or found no gratification within the Catholic concept of original sin were thought to be hereditary degenerates. Neurotic persons who could not earn a living were genetically inferior. Mental patients, the victims of an education that had already crushed what is alive in the infant, were hereditary degenerates. The black men living close to nature in Africa were sinful and in need of salvation, but the white slaver was the epitome of normality. Our psychiatric knowledge about the functions of the human animal tells us that it fought against painful self-awareness when it accused the millions of victims of its brutality and grotesque errors of having bad heredity. Bad heredity is at fault, said the biologists. They are still looking for the genes of criminal sexual intercourse during puberty. Pathologists, psychiatrists, legislators, exponents of social medicine against all the evidence, against daily experience, against the massive numbers of the sick and the dead caused by this error. The human animal felt deep inside itself a degeneracy, a deviation from all nature. But, incapable of penetrating to the heart of the matter, it put the blame on the victims of its own degeneracy. What prevented the human animal from penetrating to its own core? When the biological armoring was discovered, all the hostile camps united, psychoanalysts and communists and fascists, biologists and pathologists who blamed hereditary factors, briefly, all those who owed their social existence to the great erring united to destroy the germinating knowledge about the general biological degeneracy. If these groups had used only a fraction of their energy for fighting pornography on the newsstands of all cities in the world, for fighting political hacks and hangmen, instead of battling against truths, all ideas of guilt would long have vanished from the world. This was the error in the fourth, or biological, realm. If our assumption is correct, namely, that the great errors in human thought systems are connected with the concepts of the static absolute and with guilt, we face two principal tasks at the start of a new scientific orientation. One, we must investigate why the human animal, contrary to all sensory experiences in nature, invariably clings to the static absolute, i.e., to the immobile, to guilt. This is the task for psychology. 2. We must determine if the absolute corresponds to any reality in objective nature. Let us return to the social realm of thought. Here we find an error which, to my mind, surpasses for sheer grotesqueness and perversity all other errors committed in the entire history of human development. The critique of the absolute moral and psychological standpoint in the realm of social thinking was accomplished essentially by Karl Marx. Without denying it as such, he suspended the absolute and eternal character of the moral and psychic existence of the human animal by reducing it to the social conditions of life. Scientifically, this was a correct and great achievement. Our third, the social, realm of life happens to be smaller than the biological, but wider than the psychological, conscious, or moral domain. The psychic and moral existence is put into the social context and constantly draws the content of its ideas from this function, and by no means the other way around. The science of the social realm of life is sociology or history. It cannot work with quantities, except for statistical studies, but it rests on a conceptual system, the sociological one. In this conceptual system the psychic moral element was relativized, i.e., reduced to interpersonal relations. Since the founder of this doctrine worked at a time of prospering capitalism, it is understandable that he emphasized the capitalistic social structure. Yet he was also wise enough to relativize this capitalistic structure, namely, to seek its origin in earlier social organizations, feudal, etc. But the social thought system did not penetrate into the fourth system, the biological, of which it is a partial function. That the founder of this social thought system guessed at the interdependence between the social and the biological element can be proved by his assertion that the social process was a process of nature. Marx never held the individual capitalist responsible for social abuses, even though he openly exposed the brutality with which the proletariat was then treated, child labor, injustice, etc. Now something grotesque happened. The human animal adopted this thought system and reintroduced the absolute and static elements. Now the capitalist was, and is, to blame. The human animal banishes, murders, hangs and tortures thousands of capitalists while retaining, in camouflaged form, the very system it set out to destroy. It organizes constant terror against the individual and his freedom of thought, enlarges and absolutizes the idea of the state, which it intended to overthrow, and now puts the blame on capitalism in foreign countries. The capitalist is to blame. This has become the absolute, the static, the vast conceptual error. The absolute state is everything, man is nothing. Where the church had needed centuries to subvert its original great idea, red fascism needed only a few years to ruin a great doctrine of human emancipation and turn it into its opposite, the most vicious mass deception in the history of mankind. We are still asking questions. We are deliberately acting like a stranger in a faraway city. We want to find out why things are organized as they are, and not differently. The longtime resident of a city would not dream of asking such questions. To him, everything is routine and self-evident. Within the framework of his physical and psychic existence everything seems to be understood. There are no basic problems. The traffic jams in the streets are no problem to the native New Yorker. That's the way it is, he will tell you. That's New York for you, he will say. He does try to minimize the trouble by prohibiting parking in certain streets or by ordering one-way streets. New York happens to be a city of teeming millions, hence the traffic jam during rush hours is a feature of daily life. Within their own realms, all conceptual systems are logical and correct, similar to delusional systems. That they are incorrect is obvious only to the out-of-town visitor who asks silly questions. For instance, why have 8 million people crowded together on an island so small that they were forced to build skyscrapers in order to save space? The New Yorker is astonished by such questions and thinks they are stupid. The outsider says, America is vast. Thousands of acres of land are uninhabited. Why did 8 million people insist on settling in Manhattan? The New Yorker can explain it. New York happens to be a metropolis, or that's the way it is, or it's great to live among so many people, but why? Asks the stranger. Hundreds of thousands of children never see a tree or a field. The air is humid and polluted. All shops are overcrowded so that the purchaser has to wait a long time before being served. The apartments are small and poorly furnished, and expensive to boot. The same money would guarantee a better life in the vast areas of the country. New York is the capital of the world, is the reply. If one looks at human existence from the standpoint of its living quality, and not from the religious, industrial, governmental, or cultural aspect, one asks simple questions that seem stupid, naive, or even crazy to the local church member, factory owner, statesman or president of this or that cultural organization. About 30 years ago, when ergonomic functionalism began to ask the first naive questions about human life, no one guessed that the issue of what is life was being raised. The questions were simple and logical, and the answers were sharp and offensive to the world of the static and the absolute. Let us compile some of these naive questions. Why have all social programs of the political parties failed? Why create ever new programs only to see them fail again? Why are men unable to carry out their old and sound programs? One program is as well intentioned as the other, the Christian love for one's fellow man, the idea of liberty, equality, and fraternity, the American Constitution, the Constitution of 1848, Lenin's social democracy, etc., etc. The aspirations everywhere are the same, and so are the ideals. If all men desire peace, then why is there always another murderous war, against the will and vital interests of the global population? If there is no personal God, how can one explain the enormous power of all personalized religions? There must be a reason. If nature has established sexual maturation during puberty, why is love forbidden at that age? Why is it so hard for truth to assert itself against lies and defamation? Why is it not the other way around, that lies have to assert themselves against the truth? In the United States, the doctrine of civil rights forms the basis of the Constitution. Why does the American Civil Liberties Union have to fight against the violation of civil rights, instead of political reactionaries having to defend themselves against civil rights? Why are children so cruelly treated? Why are they swathed so tightly that they cannot move? Why are infants placed on their bellies so that they have trouble keeping their heads away from the pillow? Where does the general hatred of the child come from? Why does man hate every new, correct thought? Surely his life would be better, and not worse, if he thought correctly. Does man think at all? Or is correct thinking a special talent? How is it possible that millions of industrious people can be oppressed by a handful of rulers? Why does the average person evade serious questions that go to the heart of the matter? Why do people always discuss unessential, and never essential, matters in the United Nations? It is obvious that important matters and simple answers are avoided. Why? Why is there a vote for some functionary in every corner of the world? Why is there no vote for peace or war, an issue that concerns the lives of millions? Only fools or sages ask such simple questions. The answers are well known. Political programs are needed because man is a political animal. Political programs fail because the politicians of the other party are so corrupt. Human sinfulness, the nobility, the capitalist, the Bolshevik, and the Jew are to blame for the unhappiness. Children are tortured because they have to learn perseverance in the hard struggle for existence and because their character must be hardened. Adolescents must not enjoy love because they are too immature for it, or because they cannot enter into a marriage, or because they still have a lot to learn, or because such things aren't done, or because it would hurt the development of their morality, or because the family is sacred. The persecution of truth has always existed, and always will. Hence there must be an ethic. The trampling down of human rights is an evil the Civil Liberties Union was founded to fight. People do not think, or think incorrectly, because they just vegetate. To conduct plebiscites about war or peace is not customary. Such proposals would not get a majority of votes. In diplomatic circles it is not customary to ask important questions directly. To be diplomatic happens to be the essence of diplomacy. People hate new ideas because they happen to think sluggishly or because they happen to be tradition-bound. That is how people happen to be. The reader who has honestly thought about human life will now better understand why the true scholar and artistic creator is always outside the familiar. Not because he wants it that way, but because he must be outside if he is to accomplish anything, if he wants to avoid falling into the trap of the large errors of thinking. In the course of his errors, the human animal has not stood still. He has shown a development even in his mistakes. He has evolved from the divine being, Homo divinus, to the knowing man, Homo sapiens. When it was proved to him that he was a bundle of irrational drives, he transformed himself into the final product of development, Homo normalis. With every step of this development, the scope and depth of his errors have increased. The idea of Homo divinus was far less widespread and powerful than that of Homo sapiens. But Homo sapiens did not enjoy the power and honors of Homo normalis. Those who want to comprehend the great error of Homo normalis must reach far back, because no other conceptual error has ever erected such high barriers against being understood. If we disregard the self-evident reasons for human error, there remains a residue that is incomprehensible and bizarre, the murderous hatred of everything new and true, and of the natural function of love. To this day, the deep aversion of the average person to questions touching the core of his life is not understood. The counterpart of this aversion is man's penchant towards superficiality. One can easily have many friends as long as one stays within the framework of well-established thought patterns. The friends run off as soon as this framework is transcended. Only very few will go along. The affability and helpfulness of people also cease when their given framework of thought is transcended. We must reject explanations that merely serve to give a name to the matter, such as human stupidity, tradition, influence of the church, or politics, or the will to power and similar notions. Such verbalizations express precisely what has to be explained: superficiality and evasiveness. There must be a barrier somewhere, as if it were forbidden to touch on certain matters. What we are looking for cannot be what is commonly known as sex. For the average person talks about nothing else so much, makes about nothing else so many bad jokes, as he does about sex. It cannot simply be sexuality that is taboo. The matter goes deeper and is of a fundamental nature. It is quite easy to distinguish two basic, comprehensive thought systems in the human mind. One is of a metaphysical or mystical nature and centers on the idea of a supernatural being that shapes all events. It is the idea of God, which characterizes all religious systems, no matter how much they may differ in detail. The other system postulates a physical force penetrating and dominating everything that exists. This system is centered on the idea of an ether. In ancient Asiatic philosophies, the ether takes on the properties of a living being without actually becoming one. Prana and similar concepts. In addition to the two broad conceptual systems of God and ether, there is a third, which has no connection with any discernible processes in nature. It is characterized, most clearly in Christianity, as the devil. For the moment, the conceptual realm of the devil must be excluded because it stems from morbid human fantasy. God and ether, on the other hand, are thought systems springing from the rational attempt of the human animal to comprehend his origin. Even now we may suppose that God and ether refer to physical realities, while the devil is a totally irrational concept. We do not yet know which role is given to the irrational. The thought systems of God and ether form, each by itself, a logical construct. They are opposites. The idea of God derives everywhere from the inner psychic sensations, the idea of the ether derives from rational thought processes explaining physical phenomena. God supposedly explains the emotional and spiritual existence of man, while the ether explains his material, physical existence. Presumably these two thought systems originated independently from each other and have also been preserved independently from each other. But both conceptions are many thousands of years old. They form the nucleus of the two great systems of religion and science. Although they apply to different realms of life and operate independently, they do have very remarkable features in common. Here is a grouping of their common features. God ether is universal is the source of all existence is the source of all existence is perfect is omniscient is the basis of consciousness is eternal is static is the mover and creator of celestial bodies is the origin and mover of celestial bodies is the origin of all matter and energy is the origin of all matter and energy is impenetrable cannot be proved. Now let us look at the differences between the two ideas. God ether sensory life energy processes in nature spiritual physical, though unprovable, realm of religion, the subjective element realm of natural science, the objective element mysticism mechanistics in human thinking. God and ether have something else in common, namely, that scientific thinkers regard them both as non-existent. Materialistic natural philosophy, along the lines of La Mettrie, Buchner, Marx, Lang, etc., denies the existence of God. Einstein's school of physics denies the existence of the ether. But so far it has not been possible to replace the idea of God nor that of the ether by a useful concept of the nature and origin of life. We started with the large errors in human thinking. We are trying to understand why people err so gravely and why they cling to these errors with such tenacity. We might easily proclaim another new theory about the universe. But we would not have the slightest guarantee that we might not add a new error to the old ones. The greater the popular success of our theory, the greater the damage it would cause. It is no longer a question of new theories, any more than it is a question of new political programs. We are concerned exclusively with finding the source of stubborn human erring. The control of our conceptual technique is more important than any other task. It is no accident that with the discovery of irrationality in the human character the foundation of all physical interpretations of the universe grew shaky. Genuine natural science has always tried to test the accuracy of its judgments. One of the greatest methodological difficulties lies in the fact that although it has to describe objective functions of nature, no judgment is independent from individual sensory perception, and sensory perception belongs to the subjective sensory apparatus of the scientist. He is supposed to be objective, without ever being able to free himself from the subjective viewpoint. This basic difficulty in all scientific work is so great that influential schools have often split over the question of whether there really is an objective realm that can be perceived by the senses, empiricriticism, or even whether there is any reality at all that exists independently of our perceptions and feelings, solipsism. This idea was challenged by empiricism, which had no qualms in accepting the outside world for what it seems to be, positivism, mechanistic materialism. Added to empiricism was the powerful system of metaphysical spiritualism, which gained the widest dissemination of all thought systems. It sees no problem concerning the accuracy of our statements about nature. It proceeds from subjective feelings alone and draws uncritical conclusions from man to an absolute spirit in his own image. The uncertainties in judging one's own perceptions and conclusions have always been so great that one often felt that famous philosophical schools had run into a roadblock of compulsive brooding, example Husserl. I am merely presenting a brief survey because it is not my job to examine the scientific value of the various schools of thought. Such studies have often been undertaken by scholars with better knowledge of philosophy. My task will be limited to searching for the common principle guiding the typical human erring. The critical reader will rightly ask what entitles me to pose as the judge of human error. It might be said that only a higher being has this right. Men should remain modest and admit that man happens to be a cruelly erring creature, from time immemorial unto eternity, and that only God is omniscient. I am not so immodest as to present myself as an omniscient judge of human error. But I do claim the right to remain outside philosophical controversies and to ask why men, when they do think, utter so much nonsense, although so much that is true and tangible is all around them. As a biopsychiatrist, who, for 3 decades, has judged and treated people from all cultural and social strata, I have earned the right to introduce a new viewpoint and to test its qualifications for limiting the field of unnecessary human erring. I do not believe that my critics are genuinely modest. While they warn me to be modest and to shun the arrogance of passing divine judgments, they are presumptuous enough, every day, to describe the characteristics of God to millions of people, down to the last detail, without ever having seen God. And when the natural philosopher warns me to watch the limits of my sensory perceptions, I must answer, you have described the ether and endowed it with certain properties without ever having seen it. You have built world systems, purely in your mind, without ever perceiving or understanding a single element of empty space. You have done away with the ether, thereby committing a colossal error. You have replaced a real, pulsating, lively, functioning world with numbers. I, on the other hand, have discovered by logical thought processes a force of nature that you have consistently overlooked or denied, and therefore I am entitled to question why you were so much in error and what role the natural force I discovered plays in natural phenomena. I know that I can err, just as you can. But I do my best to protect myself from error by asking myself conscientiously how I happened to discover cosmic argon energy. Since this force of nature is universal, I am trying to find if it is in any way connected with your ideas of God and ether. In contradistinction to metaphysicians, theists and relativists, I rely on direct observations and controllable processes in nature. I am not responsible for the wide scope of the natural force I discovered. I take every available precaution to eliminate as many errors as possible. I do not philosophize and I make no statements about nature unless I have observations and controlled experiments on which to base my statements. Above all else I take account, exact account, of the relations between my own perceptions and the natural processes that are independent of myself. By placing myself outside all previous thought systems, I gain a perspective that has a chance of finding the common principle of error in all thought systems. I act like a bystander during a brawl in a saloon. I take no sides, and I take no part in the brawl. I am on the sidelines and ask myself what causes the brawlers to beat one another up. I ask if this apparently pointless fight is necessary or if it could have been avoided. I am not trying to construct a world system, although I possess far more numerous and far more basic facts about nature than any other trend in natural science. It is possible that I, too, will be forced to outline a total picture of nature for myself. But this total picture will be merely a conceptual framework and I will build it only, one if I have understood why previous thought systems erred so gravely and so typically, 2 if the world picture in my mind is produced spontaneously from a multitude of controlled facts, 3. If I have previously understood the consistency in the sequence of my findings over 3 decades. Such a consistency in discovering unknown functions must in itself be an important function of nature. It obviously affects the relationship between the natural scientist and nature which he has studied, and of which he is a part. I do not believe that these safeguards can be found elsewhere in natural research. They are indispensable because the object of my research is all-encompassing and vitally important. Furthermore, I am ready to correct any of my errors. So much for my attitude toward my own errors. The understanding of an investigative process spanning several decades, which began with the study of, much maligned, pleasure sensations and ended with the discovery of a universally existing, unknown cosmic energy, is in itself indispensable and provides a safeguard against basic errors. To reassure some religious-minded souls, I would like to add the following: I do not claim to have discovered God or ether. I merely claim to have discovered a useful, practicable fact of nature that reveals many characteristics previously attributed to God and ether. I do not know if God or ether exists. But I do know that cosmic argon energy has properties that I studied without reference to God or ether, properties that were completely unknown to me when I started my research, and equally unknown to other natural scientists, properties that I discovered piece by piece through observation and experiment, properties that came to me as the logical sequence of thought processes. I can further affirm that in 1941, when I had a long talk with Albert Einstein about my new discovery, the possible connection between argon energy and the concepts of God and ether was remote from my mind. How remote it was, and how unbiased my work, may be proved by the fact that during our whole conversation the elimination of the ether and its substitution by equations did not even occur to me, although I knew about them. So I did not set out to discover ether or God. The discovery of facts about nature that formed the basis of human concepts of an invisible God and an ether was therefore objective and unintentional. Only the decision to remain outside all traditional thought systems, never to yield to prejudices, to follow strictly my observations wherever they might lead, to control rigorously my own conceptual technique and pain